series of essays anonymously published defending the document to the public. No one will read it. I disagree.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. In a few videos for last week, we looked at some of the differences between the Constitution that James Madison got and the one that he had wanted. He had wanted a constitution with a few institutions that worked to protect rights, to protect them both from the national government and from the state governments. And he had wanted judges to be involved in those institutions, at least prior to the enactment of a law. Then we connected that to the incorporation debate, and we asked how it was that protections of rights against state laws eventually became part of our constitutional order, with the enforcement of the 14th Amendment by federal judges, using that amendment to protect the rights listed in the Bill of Rights against the states. The Constitution eventually got something like what James Madison had wanted it to have for rights protection, but ultimately not exactly the role that he had wanted for federal judges in ways that you've seen. Now this week we're actually going to take a look first at James Madison's defense of the Constitution that he got. Not the one he wanted, the one that he got. And how that ultimately affects our thinking about separation of powers, the sharing of powers today. So let's start with James Madison's thought. We're going to have two videos about that, and then we'll actually have some videos on important cases about the separation of powers. Okay, so where can we find James Madison's thought on the Constitution he got? In the Federalist Papers. Federalist Papers is a series of 85 essays written mostly by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison between October 1787 and May 1788. The essays were published anonymously under the pen name Publius in various New York newspapers at the time. Now you might be asking yourself, why New York? Well, I'll tell you why. It was considered really crucial to the general acceptance of the Constitution that New York ratify it. In fact, many of the other states would have refused to ratify if New York hadn't joined the Union. And that's true for a lot of reasons, not just the geographical way that New York separates the New England states from the rest of the colonies at the time, but also the way that New York was so vital for finance in the nation. So Hamilton and Madison wrote specifically to urge New Yorkers to ratify. Taken together, the Federalist Papers comment on nearly every provision in the proposed Constitution, sometimes giving extremely in-depth defenses of some institution or other. Since Hamilton and Madison were both delegates to the Constitutional Convention, the Federalist Papers are therefore taken sometimes to be indicative of the intentions of the framers. They are taken to tell us at least what Hamilton and Madison themselves thought was the proper interpretation of various provisions, and sometimes even to indicate the intentions of the framers as a whole, since Publius seems to actually speak on behalf of all of the supporters of the federal Constitution. But we shouldn't be too quick to interpret them in this way. The papers may not actually reveal the original intent of the framers in the way that many folks have thought. I mean, for one thing, the arguments are aimed at the citizens of New York, so at least we have to recognize that Publius crafted his arguments to focus on things that New Yorkers would find particularly appealing within the Constitution. Even if Publius is the definitive voice of the framers' mindset, as it were, it's only what the framers would want to say to New Yorkers. Now, we already see that this affected our interpretation of Hamilton's arguments about judicial review in Federalist number 78. It's particularly aimed at opponents of the Constitution who feared the power given to judges by the length of their terms. So Hamilton was picking out a particular audience, a particular fear that they might have had, and attempting to address that. So you'll recall that he argues that their power, the power of judges that is not too much and just enough to do the right things. So it's sort of a Goldilocks argument. Not too much power, not too little power, just enough power to do the right things. Did he really believe this? Or did he just say it to win support? I don't think that's a question we can ever answer. In his editions of the Federalist Papers, Madison sometimes argues eloquently for provisions that he opposed at the Constitutional Convention. And he sometimes argues using principles in direct contradiction to crucial beliefs that he had expressed at the convention. And all of this you can actually see from our lectures about all the things Madison lost in the Constitutional Convention. So, we'd have to ask the same question about him as we did about Hamilton. Was the stuff he said in the Federalist simply calculated to win political support? It may be. Now, at least historically, Madison's Federalist Papers have been widely taken to use one concept that he seems definitely to have endorsed, and we're going to call that the concept of democratic institutionalism. Now, it may at first seem strange to you that anything about Madison could be labeled democratic, because throughout the Federalist Papers and in his statements in the debates in the Constitutional Convention, he repeatedly refers to the democracies of ancient Greece in particular as the most disordered, the most short-lived forms of government. So in Federalist 55, for instance, you'll see this on page 336 of your readings, he's speaking about the large democratic assemblies of Athens, and he says this: "In all very numerous assemblies, of whatever character composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Had every Athenian citizen been a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would still have been a mob." Madison's experience with the disordered states of his own time, but also his reading of history, had convinced him that the mass of people, however educated they were unable to carry out their political business in a stable, prudent manner. So the people, in that quote, are not associated with reason, that necessary element to fundamental law that Hamilton spoke of. Instead, their passion takes over from reason. So Madison therefore expressed his wish, especially in Federalists 14 and 39, that rather than a pure democracy in which the people meet to exercise their government in person, America should have a republic in which government is administered by representatives and agents of the people. A republic, for Madison, would therefore have been a classic mixed form of government, a form that partook of some of the qualities of democracy, but also of the good qualities of aristocracy via the Senate and of monarchy via the presidency. But if the American Republic was not, in Madison's mind, a democracy, it was at least democratic in some measure. Democrat-ish, we might say. As Madison says in Federalist 39, this is on page 255, he says, "A republic derives all its powers directly or indirectly from the great body of the people, and is administered by persons holding their offices during pleasure, for a limited period, or during good behavior." So Madison didn't think that the people needed to be involved directly in legislation, but he sure did think that they needed to be involved directly or indirectly in choosing the people who would make and enforce the legislation. Indeed, Madison thought that only in those governments where people control their rulers, that is, only in republics, is the common good pursued at all. An extremely important point that's going to form the basis of much of our analysis for the rest of these lectures. Okay, but as we're going to see later, his definition of the common good is actually fairly nebulous. We could say generally that the common good or the public good means the fulfilling of various material interests of the people, leading them to a comfortable life in the enjoyment of their property, but it's not actually clearly defined, and so it's left a little bit vague, and we're going to get into what that ambiguity is later. Okay, but before we get to that, let's talk about his argument for institutions. Madison's hope is that the Constitution will be a form of government that the people can control so as to pursue their common good, but will likewise be controlled in that this government will be incapacitated from trampling on rights. This is the danger posed by the passions of the people, and institutions are how you mitigate that danger. In Federalist 10, he complains that the systems of government then in place, both in the nation and in the states, accomplish neither of these objectives. They don't pursue the common good or protect rights. He complains on page 123 that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, and that measures are too often carried not according to the rules of justice, you'll remember that word from our lectures last week, and the rights of the minor party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority. Through institutions, one could have a democratic republic that the people controlled towards the end of achieving the public good, but a republic that was at the same time under control in that it wouldn't violate rights. Now, one striking thing about this, people have noted, is that Madison seems to say that you can achieve the public good without anyone in the republic ever aiming at the public good. In fact, perhaps he's saying that you can achieve the public good without anyone even being good. We're going to see that argument unfold over time. At times, he seems to call for goodness in those who are elected. He says, for instance, in Federalist 52, that representatives ought to have sympathy with the people. He argues that the legislature, at least the lower branch of it, ought to have, quote, an immediate dependence on and an intimate sympathy with the people. Frequent elections are unquestionably the only policy by which this dependence and sympathy can be effectually secured. So intimate sympathy seems good, right? And it can also seem at times that Madison is relying on the goodness of representatives to pursue the common good. He says, for instance, in Federalist 55, that one cannot believe those who think men are all bad. On page 339, he says this, as there is a degree of depravity in mankind, which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. Republican government presupposes the existence of these qualities in a higher degree than any other form. Were the pictures which have been drawn by some among us faithful likenesses of the human character, the inference would be that there is not sufficient virtue among men for self-government, and that nothing less than the chains of despotism can restrain them from destroying and devouring one another. So, those pictures that have been drawn by some, as he says, cannot be a reliable guide to human nature, at least in a republic. A republic relies on qualities of humankind that actually do not set men at odds in the way that some have suggested. But ultimately, Madison doesn't want to rely on goodness or virtue, as he says in that quote. At least in the Federalist Papers, he's like Hamilton in attributing rash, ill-considered, passionate actions to the masses. In the end, Madison seems to argue that we can't rely on sympathy or virtue to ensure that representatives pursue the common good. Instead, institutions have to be constructed. So, right now, I'm going to take a close look at Federalist 10, perhaps the most famous of the papers, surely the most famous of the ones that Madison wrote, to see how his argument about the need for institutions proceeds. In our next video, we'll look at the argument in more depth in Federalist 51, which is really the most developed of Madison's Federalist Papers and the deepest expression of his theory of institutions. Now, at the beginning of Federalist 10, Madison says that the propensity among people to divide into self-interested factions is so strong that, as he says, where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excite their most violent conflicts. So people, he's saying, are such that they will fight over trivialities if there's nothing more substantial for them to get their teeth into. But, he goes on to say, there is always something for them to get their teeth into. He says, quote, the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. So he seems to think that the demands of the propertyless are perhaps the greatest threats to rights. But what can be done to stop such people from forming their own self-interested factions? Well, nothing, essentially. Madison says that wherever the people have the liberty to form their own interests, they will create factions. He says, liberty is to faction what air is to fire. So there's no way to completely stop them but the suppression of liberty itself, which would be as foolish as trying to stop fire by sucking all the air out of the world. It would kill everything else too. So rather than hoping for or working towards the abolition of faction, he urges that America ought to use the representative system set out in the Constitution to dull the effects of faction. Why? Well, for one thing, the representatives might be more calm, cool, and virtuous than the people they represent. He says, their wisdom may be best to discern the true interests of their country, and their patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. See those themes of wisdom, passion, and time playing into that quote there. So that's one reason he gives for relying on the institutions of the Constitution. But on the other hand, the politician in him recognizes that factious, unvirtuous men may still get into the national legislature. What to do about them? Well, Madison says in Federalist 10, rely on the size of the nation to cancel out the particular interests of small groups that might form in one little corner of the nation. If a faction in Georgia, for instance, wants one thing, and a faction in Massachusetts another, neither is going to be able to get enough votes in the national legislature to carry their little peculiar pet interest. That is his theory that's been called the theory of the extensive republic, which is further elaborated in some ways in Federalist 51. But in Federalist 10, that's essentially the only answer that he gives. Factional interests will be small and isolated in particular parts of the new nation, and so one ought not to worry that a match would sort of kindle a fire that would take those factional interests and expand them across the nation. But Madison really quickly becomes dissatisfied with the answer that he's given. The small problem of faction that he identified in Federalist 10 is really much bigger than he explains it. And so he needs a new theory in Federalist 51, a much more advanced theory in Federalist 51. And we're going to actually take a look at that theory and the complexities of it in our next video. So I look forward to welcoming you back for that.